All right, guys, this is the last series that we have in the Crisis Presidents. We're going to be talking about Nixon, Ford, and actually Carter as well, because he was towards the end of the 70s. And right before Reagan, so technically he is grouped together with those presidents that we consider the crisis presidents as well. So let's go and get started. Sometimes this is called the conservative uh, revolution, although a lot of times the conservative revolution is really considered in the 80s, but this is kind of the start of this time period as well. And so this is a great video that does deal with this as well. So the presidency of Richard Nixon, he is elected in 1968. Of course, LBJ decides that he is not going to run for re-election, and rightly so, probably because he would have definitely gotten defeated anyway. But it does open up the idea of who is going to run against Nixon. Of course, Nixon had run against JFK and lost because he didn't understand some of the stuff. Now, Nixon is a unique president. He's actually, strangely enough, one of the best foreign policy presidents, but is again one of the most secretive presidents. He does some things that are underhanded. Of course, he is involved in the Watergate scandal. He is reelected in 1972, but is the only president to be technically he wasn't removed from office. He was going to be brought underneath impeachment charges, and he decided to resign. So technically, in our presidents, we've had three presidents that have been impeached. That is impeached by the House of Representatives. So that's Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and of course Donald Trump. This is as of even of this year, right? But they were not removed by the Senate, which is the one that removes president. The Richard Nixon would have been impeached and probably removed because of his actions. All right. So this is the 1968 election. Just kind of gives you a map of what it looks like. This is a little mini biography on Nixon. Take time to watch this. Not very long, but definitely gives some interesting things about him. Now, his domestic policies, domestic meaning together, he has what we call new federalism, his plan to decrease the size and influence of the federal government, which is what he kind of ran on with the Republican Party. The plan would give federal power to state and local governments. Now, this is where the switch of the Southern Democrats, remember the party of the South was the Democrat Party in the Civil War, right? So this is actually when the Southern Democrat Party switches to support a Republican, and this is he calls it his Southern strategy. Appeals to their unhappiness with federal desegregation and a liberal Supreme Court. And so this is when the switch in the early 70s begins from consistently being Democrat and voting Democrat to being Republican and voting Republican for primarily and for with that time period. So four members of the Supreme Court do leave or are removed. They personally they remove themselves during Nixon's presidency, and he replaces the very liberal Warren Court with some pretty conservative judges, and that reshapes the idea of the Supreme Court system for the next 20 years. And so it's kind of an interesting thing that happens during this time. And of course, a lot of presidents run on the idea of being able to select the Supreme Court nominee and get them through the process there. Of course, that is what President Trump ran on as well, and he has been able to appoint two justices, and depending on if he wins re-election or not, he will probably just with all probability at least one or maybe two more Supreme Court justices. So his domestic issues, there's a what we call stagflation. It's kind of the worst of both worlds. You got a high inflation and high unemployment, and so it really hurts. Of course, a lot of that is based on our dependence on foreign oil. Now we've recently come off of that dependence because we are now one of the main exporters of foreign energy oil. But it was a big deal. So you got unemployed workers from the baby boom. You got a lot of high immigration coming in. The OPEC is formed during this time, and most of these countries are Middle Eastern, and we have a lot of conflict even during this time period. You've got Iran that becomes a very big player in this world at that time, and a lot of conflict with the United States as well. So U.S. support of Israel angers the primarily Middle Eastern Arab nations, and oil shortages, high gas prices come about. This is an image of the OPEC in 1973, and of course afterwards there's several that join as well, but you can see that the majority of them are right in this Middle Eastern area. Okay, so this is gas shortages, and some images that people would line around the gas station. They had to get gas on certain days, which was interesting based on your whether or not your last digit on your license tag was an odd number or an even number as the days that you got to visit. It's pretty interesting how that all works out. I've been through a gas shortage, and it's a unique situation because of how it works. I remember getting up in Phoenix. We had a pipeline that actually burst, and we had a gas shortage that I would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to go down to the gas station and have to wait in line for 2 hours just to get gas so I could go to work. We have had gas shortages in this area. We had a gas pipeline a couple of years ago that burst, and we had some interesting gas shortages as well. So his foreign policies was probably the one that got him the best respect, and we call this the realpolitik, which means realpolitics believes that foreign policy should be based solely on consideration of a nation's power and not actually their ideals or moral principles, which kind of takes out the idea of communism being bad, and the idea of communism. We went to war in Korea and in Vietnam based on the idea we didn't want communism to spread, and it's just more of an ideology instead of an actual, are they a powerful nation that it has a system that could possibly hurt us. He also attempts a policy known as détente, and this is aimed at easing Cold War tensions, and he actually does ease those tensions by visiting communist China and the Soviet Union. Now, this is actually talked about in the movie Forrest Gump, where they talk about the easing of some of those tensions when China and representative from China and representative from the United States play in a ping pong tournament. And this actually did happen. So it's kind of an interesting reduction of tension that happens. We also have a SALT I treaty, which is called Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. It's an agreement to limit the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and we actually have during Carter's administration, the SALT II treaty as well. So this is détente, and you can see this ping pong paddles that I talked about before, and that kind of stuff. Now, what Nixon is most famously noted for is his Watergate scandal. And this happens at the Watergate Hotel. This is the hotel itself. This is in Washington, D.C. And, of course, in Forrest Gump, it talks about Forrest Gump being involved in that. And obviously that's not the case, but they do make allusions and references to it. So this is the DNC, the Democratic National Committee headquarters, is broken into, and the idea that Nixon had knowledge of this break-in is the key area there. And so the burglars were going to steal key Democratic strategy, tap phones, had connections with Nixon, and they did tap phones, and they actually tapped phones and didn't get caught. And then when they went back in to actually help update some of those wiretaps, that's when they got caught. And Nixon does try to stop the investigation, cover up some of the information, destroy evidence, which is why this little tape measure, or this tape reel here, there were splices of audio that had been cut out of his personal audio devices that he had secretly recorded conversations in the Oval Office, and you're not supposed to do that, but he had secretly recorded those, and then he basically told his secretary that you need to destroy that evidence. So that's kind of an interesting debate about that. There's two reporters that come about. And they are they investigate, and Nixon chooses to resign instead of get through the whole impeachment and the removal process in the Senate. And so obviously he is a big part of the Vietnam War era as well. He withdraws troops from Vietnam, called this Vietnamization. But it was still one of those things that comes about. Now, economics, Ford, Carter, these are the two presidents that come about. Ford is Nixon's running mate, or vice president, and he obviously steps in line. Now, he steps in because there is no I there's no thought that he was involved in this. He had no knowledge of this, and so people trusted that. Unfortunately, one of the first things that he did when he enters office, he's trying to basically say, "Okay, guys, let's move on. Let's move on." Americans were not ready to move on, and when Ford pardoned Nixon, this was seen as a sign of, hey, he did right, and the government's still corrupt and all that kind of stuff. So it basically caused him to not have a lot of faith in the American people, or the American people not have faith in him. And he was an interesting president. He actually, there was an assassination attempt on his life. He's known for his clumsiness. He fell down the ramps of his airplane. He is known for some clumsy things that has happened. But he also was probably one of our most brilliant presidents. He knew the numbers of our economy, our finances very, very well. And unfortunately, he just had some negative aspects that was connected to the politics of the government. So then that brings up our last president of the crisis era presidents, and this is Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter is probably one of the most the nicest presidents out there. He was a Christian. He lived by his faith. And matter of fact, he is still alive. I have actually seen him. He came to my graduation a few years ago, my doctoral graduation, and I got to see him in person. And very interesting president. Works even today. He's the only president that after he left office received the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, there have been several presidents while in office that have received the Nobel Peace Prize, but he's the only president after his office from his work that he did for several places and groups that he received that, and he's very vocal about that. But he was an outsider. He was not in the political machinations. He was a peanut farmer, and he was from the middle part of the country. And people just said, "I don't want a president that is involved in all the politics of it." Unfortunately, because he wasn't involved in all the politics, he did not handle the political machinations very well. He did do a couple of really good things. The National Energy Act, the act places tax on gas guzzling cars. However, he's trying to get our dependence off of oil reduced, and he creates FEMA, which is that Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is still part of our stuff today. Um, but he does have a lot of domestic issues, and this is where he comes about, and he basically human rights was a big thing for him. It kind of renews some of the Cold War tensions because he focuses on groups like China and Russia, their civil rights stuff that they were not treating humanely their own citizens. So he ramps up a little bit of that tension again, and he agrees to turn over the Panama Canal on December 31st of 1999, which did happen, and unfortunately did cause some issues and backlash because when we removed our military presence down in Panama, that allowed the a lot more drugs to come through that area. Now, that didn't mean the drugs were not already there, but there was a kind of a limitation on that. But that has been, for the past 20 years, Panama has owned their Panama Canal and have rights to it. Now, this big success was at Camp David, which they called the Camp David Accords, where you got Israel and Egypt to sign a peace agreement. And this is huge. And Egypt gets hit very hard in its own oil production and some of the things because they were an Arab nation, and Israel is a Israeli nation, and they don't always get along. But he does help them sign that peace agreement. Now, his big failure is called the Iran hostage crisis, and this is where the Iranian government captures. Our American citizens, our diplomats, kill some. Now there is a movie that was made. It's called Argo, and this is where we're trying to get out our citizens, and we do get out some, but we don't get out others, and they are held for over 400 days, and they actually don't aren't released until Ronald Reagan becomes president. Matter of fact, because the Iranian government hated Carter so much, they had already landed the plane with these prisoners. And not until Reagan took office, the oath of office, were they allowed to be let off that plane. So it was kind of an interesting thing. Now there's Iran, Iraq in 3 minutes. There's a lot of conflict between Iran and Iraq and all that stuff. This is the Middle East peace agreements between Egypt and Israel, and then the Tehran hostage crisis that comes about. And this is where Iran, even though we're still dealing with a lot of the Iranian stuff, this is really when it becomes boiled over. And of course, Reagan and previous our presidents from previous times are having to still deal with that. All right, so that's what we have for our crisis presidents. Just a quick overview. Boy, I wish I could go into a lot more detail with you and show you some of the videos, but take a second to watch these because they really do help you understand what the process is. And guys, we are still dealing with some of the issues during that time now. So we're still dealing with some of the stuff with Iran. We're still dealing with the OPEC and the oil shortages and the oil crisis and all the economic stuff that happens with that. We're still dealing with China, right? Some of the things with the coronavirus, right? And some of the unknowns and possibly that there was a lab that was let out the virus. There's the death toll has been reduced. If China might have given us a little bit more information and heads up, we might have been able to save a lot more people because we would have been restricting certain things. So a lot of that stuff is still happening, and why you need to know history and why some of the things that are cyclical, they're coming around. And if you don't understand some of the history that has happened, you just assume, well, this is just new, and it's not. It's not a new thing. It's a continuation of a lot of things that have been going on. And so that's one of the big things that we'll be talking about in our next in the modern America topic for this last unit in American history, is the unique ideas of how the past has shaped us today. All right, and that's really important. So hopefully you stick with me for this next one, and we'll go from there. All right, bye.